The black abyss wrapped tightly around Twilight. She wondered how could she move her legs at all. Walking forward unintentionally was all that she could do. The world was crushing her with its presence, weighing down on her muscles and thoughts, but all she could do was continue. The air began to part and return to her lungs with ease. With each step, the drowning abyss seemed to fade and the world slowly returned around her. Heavy foot hoof steps struck against the solid ground, with light began to focus something before her. In the distance before her was a pair of twin metal doors that seemed to be connected to the surrounding area. The concrete ground she walked on now seemingly to spread outwards towards those doors. She approached them with uncertainty of what lay beyond, but she knew she had to go through them. All the same, she raised her hoof and pushed them open. She then stepped inside and the doors closed shut behind her. The room she entered looked like a dungeon. Old stones stacked together, covered in various amounts of moss, grime, and blood. Chains hanging from various locations, connected to the bones of former ponies, sinners of crimes long gone. Burning torches were scattered around, illuminating the stone prison. In the center of it, a large white pony, bound by chains, lay on the stone slab, her once wreathful hair flat out against the ground. Celestia! Twilight then rushed over to her mentor. The alicorn seemed to be twitching her spot, her chains rusting as she moved. She had to look up at her student. Twilight just stood there for a moment, a foot before her, staring down in shock at the chains that kept her teacher bound to the stone slab before her. Twilight, Celestia spoke, horror slowly seeping into her voice. What are you doing here? Never mind that now. We have to get you out of those chains. Twilight spoke quietly, eyeing where the chains are connected. It looked as if they were dug down deep onto the floor. The chains went too far deep to be able to cut them out from the cement, which meant that she would just have to cut the chains. She summoned her black sword before her, aiming at the ends of the chains and away from Celestia's body, and she swung down hard and the blade hitting the chains dead on. A loud metallic strike ran out, and from the impact, but the chain did not yield. She then pulled the sword back. She couldn't see if that she had made a scratch. That sword, Celestia spoke quietly, staring at the black sharp blade that Twilight was wielding. Where did you get that? It's hard to explain. The simple answer is, I found it. Twilight grunted as she pulled the sword up and slammed it down against the chain again. It's sort of been following me through this damn world, but now that it's mine, it's proven useful. She landed down another slam against the chain, her teeth beginning to grind in frustration. That sword, it belonged to Merlin a long time ago. Celestia spoke quietly with each of Twilight's strikes. He'd always had a fascination with swords. It was his hobby. If he wasn't studying spells, he was usually indulging crafting swords. Another loud clang punctuated her swords as Twilight's breath came heavier. The sword you're welding now, that was his masterpiece. Twilight let out a groan of exasperation. This stupid chain won't break. She was panting from the exteration, staring down at the chain that had yet to be scratched. I don't think it should. It's not even a sword made of scale and iconiogia to break those chains. Twilight shifted under her chains and better looked at Twilight. I doubt even Merlin himself could have broken these. He could shape the unbreakable to this, but the binding sins weigh us down forever. Twilight stepped back from the chains, binding her mentor, panting and staring at them. Her eyes even wandered back to Celestia, searching for some kind of way. Princess, I've traveled through the pits of hell and back just to find you, to save you. Twilight then shook her head, not wanting to believe it. And you're telling me that I made it all the way out here, only for me not to be able to save you? The princess was quiet, unsure of what to say or how to respond. She couldn't bring herself to say anything, leaving Twilight to stare. Twilight's mind searched for a solution, for some way to the chains to break or to go to her mentor out of them from under them. That spell, her mind cried out. If no weapon could break the chains, Perhaps Merlin's most powerful spell could. This must be the one what he's meant to use for. She concluded with confidence, and she steadied her stance and lowered her head, closed her eyes, and all concentrated. All she had to do was focus on the spell, cast the magic in a single spot, call it for the dwarf's name, and she could free Celestia. The world around her seemed to have paused for a moment. She was trying to focus to channel her all into the spell. The seconds passed and she still concentrated, but nothing was happening. She can't even focus her magic into her own spell. The seal that she kept breaking from the spell, activating it wouldn't allow it. But what? Why? She mentally screamed as she tried again to trigger the spell. To break the seal, I need to be under duress. What more does it want from me? She then cried out and echoed around the dungeon, slamming her hoof against the ground. Celestia looked at sorrow at her student, unable to move or help in any way. The monarch of the land trapped her by her sins. For what it's worth, I'm not surprised. Twilight nearly jumped out of her skin at the sound of the second voice. She swung around and saw a familiar stallion she had expected to see here. I suppose at the end we all succumb to our sins, but this is a little bit more literal than I imagined. Magus chuckled softly as he walked next to Twilight, before stopping to look at the end of the Tide Monarch. Magus? Twilight's voice convoyed in shock. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be looking after Spike. You should know better than anyone that things do not go as planned here. Magus shook his head slowly, causing Twilight to wince a little. Okay, fine. Then where is Spike? Is he okay? Twilight demanded, slamming her hoof to the ground once more. The little dragon was fine the last I saw him. He was in the sanctuary I set up, so unless he's moved, he should be okay. Magus nodded his head, causing Twilight to relax a little. As long as he's safe. Twilight then turned her back to her mentor. We need to free her out of these bonds. Magus tapped a hoof against his chin and fought. If the chains are a construct of this world, then I can imagine my spell would free her just fine. Magus smirked. Shall I give it a try? The sooner the better, Twilight said, looking at her mentor. I'm tired of this world. If Celestia is free, I'm sure we can end this nightmare with her help. The one runic circle coming up. Magus's horn lit up as he flickered his head on the light, appearing around Celestia. Her head moved a little. The rattling changed. She looked down at the light that surrounded her. Slowly through the light, she saw the red markings begin to appear and starting with 2 circles on each side. Once the circles had formed, the runic markings began to form within, and as Twilight saw the markings, her eyes widened. What are you doing? Celestia demanded, raising her head sharply, only to be forced to be tugged by the chains. You fool! Do you know what powers you are messing with? You must stop this at once. Huh? Twilight asked in confusion, and her mentor's sudden shift in behavior. I've seen him do this before, but it's what I need to know right now. Why should he be stopped? No, you can't! Celestia struggled against the chains as the spell neared her completion. You have to stop! You don't know what you're doing! Celestia's eyes widened further, and her breath got caught in her throat. The light of Magus' spell vanished as the runic symbol appeared beneath her. Her body began to shake as the chains rattling violently. She restrained herself against the chains, the loud crackling of the metal slinks striking each of the room as she struggled. What's going on? Aren't the chains supposed to disappear? Twilight cried, quickly turning to Magus for an answer. This is certainly an interesting reaction. Magus spoke in his usual weird way, still a smirk on his face, with his hoof on his chin. I could certainly say I didn't expect this. What do you mean you didn't expect this? Twilight shouted, looking at Celestia again. The monarch's eyes were the wide as saucers. Her body was thrashing against the chains. Her pupils appeared to have faded away, leaving the eyes a white voids of their former selves. You've got to stop this now! Twilight shrieked at Magus, staring at the thrashing of Celestia. Magus then rubbed his chin, and his grin grew wider. I don't think I can stop this. At this point, I can only study. Twilight's eyes grew at his words as she instantly snapped her gaze back at her mentor. The flesh on Celestia His back had grown, sprouting out like an oversized tumor. The sickly brown flesh pulsed and pulled against the change, and it swelled even larger. Twilight couldn't move. She could only stare in horror as her teacher transformed in front of her. Celestia's neck elongated again off the slab and hitting the ground. The chains rattled loudly as they were pulled further out of the ground by the growing flesh on Celestia's back. Her wings began to droop, growing longer, even though through the restraints and the changing into a deathly gray color. The monarch's head began to split, blood dribbling down between the lines, and her skull cracked open. And a new head appeared inside of Celestia's bulbous brown head, similar to the shape of that of a hairless chimera. Red eyes at the center, where the white pupils are staring forward. The head rose up as the body grew. Elongated wings started to rise in the air, wiggling with life. The legs of the monarch then stepped out of the slab, slammed onto the concrete floor with deafening impact. No longer the slim, slender legs of a pony, but thick clawed legs of a monster. Once a beautiful ruler of the land was no longer recognizable. Before Twilight became soon loomed with a large monster of flesh and power. Something that looked down upon with doubt and disgust. This wasn't her loving mentor and ruler anymore. This was a tyrant. Amazing, Magus whispered, his eyes wide and grin plastered on his face, stepping closer to the heavy large mass that made up of the tyrant. She grew at least 15 times her size, and towers over me now. Magus laughed, standing before the once beautiful monarch. This is absolutely incredible. I have to study every moment of this. Magus! Twilight cried out. Get away from her! Magus then turned to look at Twilight in surprise. I can't. I have to study this. Can't you see how much we can learn from this? Magus was then silenced by a withering tentacle, smacking the side of his body with force, and with a loud thud. His body went sailing through the air, smashing straight into the side of the dungeon wall. Twilight's heart dropped as her sword snapped into the tension in front of her. A pair of tentacles slammed on the ground before her, shaking the small world around her. The tyrant roared into the ceiling as it brought this attention to Twilight. Twilight's eyes darted at the tentacles that writhed against the ground next to her. Following their source, she could only see that they had been once Celestia's feathers, mutated into a hideous new form. Following another of the tyrant's roars, they rose into the air and spun down in another to attempt to crush her. Twilight tumbled, rolling out of its way of the tentacle at the last moment. She was back on her hooves and was staring at what once was her mentor, unsure of what to do. Her sword already stood ready, but her heart wavered. Twilight couldn't even stop seeing her loving mentor in front of her, even if she had turned into a monstrous tyrant. Princess, please stop this. I don't want to hurt you, Twilight cried out, hoping somewhere deep inside the princess would retain her senses. The tyrant only bellowed another roared, its large appendages rising into the air for another strike. Twilight gritted her teeth and jumped out of the outcoming attack, hearing the tendril slam down behind her and cracking with the concentrate underneath. Her heart was racing as she ran, staring at the large, deformed body of her teacher. The tyrant slowly turned and tried to keep up with her, the intent on lashing out against the one lone pony in the room. How? Twilight mind screamed at her. How can I stop her without hurting her? Twilight shrieked as she skidded to a halt, a large tendril smashing down right on her path. She quickly looked behind her to see the tyrant's head coming straight towards her, her mouth open and her teeth bared. With only seconds to spare, she crouched down with her hooves and jumped, the tyrant's head stopping just inches away from where she had been. A large spike shot forth from its mouth, impaling the spot where Twilight had just been standing. Twilight landed and skidded to a stop as the monster wrenched her spike free and retracted it. I don't think I can avoid hurting her, Twilight gulped, raising her sword against the tendrils, pulled back and pressed the attack. But I can't kill the princess. I just can't. Twilight shook her head. Maybe I could stop her just by hurting her? Her teeth ground to the floor at thought. It's either that or run around until she manages to kill me. Forgive me, princess. Twilight steeled her resolve, determined to not to die here. The tyrant's piercing roar echoed throughout the chamber as Tendril descended quickly. Twilight was already at the time of plan in mind. She dodged to the side, letting the appendage slam onto where she had been standing. The crackling cement of the impact blew small shards around her, but her furious focus was steady fast and was strong. With a thrust, the black blade embedded itself into the flesh of the tendril. The tyrant let out a loud shriek as the tendril reflectively lashed out. Twilight was caught off guard and tossed across the room, hitting the floor with a painful thud. She groaned as her sword scattered down next to her. She rubbed her head, quickly getting back to her hooves. The tyrant wasn't happy with her. Its tendril flailing about haphazardly, trying to strike her again. Her sword scraped against the ground as her magic readied it once more. The tyrant's eyes refocused sharply in on Twilight. Twilight braced herself with the tendrils crashing down in her with full force. She dodged as best she could, her sword slashing around in the air as the appendages attempted to smash her. Her sword sliced through the flesh. She could only manage to hit it, the blade unable to cut through completely, but leaving deep gashes in the wake. The roaring tyrant bore down on her, attacking her with a relentless assault. It was all Twilight could do to keep herself from being hit. A loud thud echoed throughout her mind as the air escaped from her body. She felt her hooves relieve the ground, head spinning out of focus until pain assaulted her, sailing through her back. A tendril was pressed down hard against her body, pressing hard against the stone what all made up of the dungeon. A gasp of pain came out as a single strangled breath, as blood escaped from her mouth. It trickled down her chin as she struggled, just trying to breathe as she stared at the pulsating, sickening brown tendril that was pressed up against her body. Her vision was wavered, but the tendril blurring in and out of focus as the pain rocked in her being. Is this it? She thought, her mind unable to comprehend what was going on. Am I going to die here? At the hooves of my mentor? Twilight's head slowly lifted, looking at the once beautiful head of the beloved teacher, not twisted in the shape of a dead-skinned chimera. Damn you, Merlin. Your spells saved no one, not even myself. Twilight's head lowered. Her vision began to fade out as pain assaulted her senses, and it became harder for her to breathe. I'm sorry, everyone. Twilight begged for her friends for forgiveness as her eyes began to close. I tried. I came this far, but I couldn't save you. Please don't hate me. Her mind was growing dark, fading away into nothing. The pain began to fade into her mind, and her mind began to drift away. Her eyes closed as she drifted off to a final sleep. Twilight! Twilight's eyes snapped open, all the pain returning as a huge gasp of air suddenly filled her lungs. The tendril crushing her and relaxed its grip, letting the unicorn breathe for a moment. That had distracted the tyrant. Twilight, I'm here. Just hold on. That voice. No, it can't be. Not here. Not now. Twilight's mind cried. Her head she turned slowly. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want it to be true. Not here, not now. Not with the tyrants looking around for blood. I'll get you down from there. A small whirling paddle purple dragon called out, heading forward straight to her. She could see the fear in his eyes. He ran without a plan, no idea what he was doing, and compelled only that the needed help to Twilight. Spike, run! It was all Twilight could scream. This was not a place that she ever wanted to see the young dragon. Not in this hell. Not facing an abomination of what once was Celestia. Twiga! The young dragon's words were cut off by the force of the tyrant's tendril. The appendage quickly wrapped itself around the young dragon's body, lifted him to the air. Spike, no! Twilight cried out, ignoring the pain racking through her chest. The small dragon held on right into the gaze of the tyrant. Spike's eyes were wide with fear, his small body trembling as he came face to face with his captor. As the two stared at each other for a short moment, Spike only managing a gulp of dread, his fear began to slowly fade as he looked up into the eyes, something gradually dawning on him. Princess, is that you? He croaked out, having difficulty breathing by the tightness that squeezed him. The tyrant maintained his glare, only replied with a low growl. Celestia, it's me, Spike. I know that's you in there. I can sense it. Don't you recognize me? The tyrant's head tilted a little, slowly drawing out the small dragon closer. The Spike wriggled a little, trying to manage to get his arm free from the tendril's grip. He held it out, showing his openness to the creature. Celestia, you're like a mother to me. Come on, let's put a stop to this, okay? Twilight, Spike pleaded with once more the mighty ruler of Equestria. The tyrant then tilted his head again, drawing closer to Spike. A smile that only formed on his face as he reached out to hold on to his mother. A second sound cut the air, followed by a crushing silence of Twilight's eyes, widening in shock. The tyrant's mouth was open, the lance kept inside as it extended. On the other end of the dragon's body could be seen at a sharp point, a weapon having to be sailed clean right through. The tyrant's head tilted the other way, only this time taking as a moment to admire the look. Then the lance was then withdrawn and Spike was let go. His small body fell quietly before hitting the ground with a dull thud. Twilight could only stare. Her mind was unable to process anything of what had just happened. Then she saw it, but she couldn't believe it. Spike was lying on the floor, a large hole ripped through his chest. His blood was quickly pooling around the small frame of his body. He wasn't moving, not even twitching. His color visibly faded with each second. No longer the bright purple and green dragon she knew. Spike, Twilight weakly called out from his trembling lips. Spike, get up, she begged him. The little dragon didn't make any move to respond. Twilight could see it in her mind. She could see him getting up and dusting himself, and then just looked at her with a chuckle, rubbing the back of his head, and remarked on how close that had been. Her young assistant had always been with her. When she was alone in her dorm, Spike had been there to help her with her studies. He had taken care of the organization to ensure that everything was where it should be. He gave her a second opinion. He was afraid to let his mind be known. To her, he had just been like her little brother, or maybe even like a son. You killed him! Twilight struggled to get the words out, staring at the small body of the baby dragon. He called you mother, and you killed him! Twilight could feel the presence of it from the pressure of the tendril, picking up again and pressing harder against the wall. Her mind refused to register it, only focusing on what just happened. You killed him, she muttered again. Her teeth started to grind. Her mind began to smolder. Her body started shaking as it fought back against the tendril, crushing her. The single thought repeated again and again inside of her mind, stroking her building rage, burn ever hotter. Her magic began to pulse through right through her horn, concentrating on a single point. Her body pulsed. Her eyes began to shine. You killed him! Twilight's eyes then cried shook the room, her magic sweeping the ground. The black sword was quickly picked up, sailing right through the air and stabbing the tendril holding her down. The tyrant cried out, pulling back and letting go of Twilight, roaring in pain as it assaulted its appendage. Twilight landed on her hooves, her mind focusing on the magic as channeled to the end of her horn, all doubt having to be burnt away in fury. Trying to seal on Merlin's spell unraveled in her mind. She could see it now. She could now focus on it. The spell's power began to mix with her own, concentrating on the single spot right above her head. A flash of memory from Merlin followed behind it, bringing the spell into sharp clarity. Crafted spells are my special talent, but making swords is my hobby. So I decided that my life's work, the spell I built my life around it, would encompass both. A spell that was channeled to the raw, perfect power of magic, into the shape of the most elegant sword I could craft. A sword was made of magic, only wieldable by those who have access to the power of element of harmony of symbol of magic. This sword would be my most powerful creation. It cannot be entrusted just by anyone. The sword as a beacon, a powerful symbol and magic. I can only entrust to some pony who I know would use it for good, who would not use and abuse its power for greed or lust or power. No, this weapon would have no name attached to the person who uses it, and only when the sword shall be called for, its name will be known. The spell then took a shape in front of her, the golden aurora just hanging different inches away. The spell was drawing forth of Twilight's magic, shining bright gold as it formed into a sword made of pure magic. The tyrant let out a roar, staring down at the glowing aurora of light before. It was unable to comprehend what was happening, optimally to simply use its tendrils to wander, trying to gouge out the right moment to strike. They knew in readying to attack, unsure of what the light was going to do. Twilight wasn't going to let it through, though. Her magic was channeled, and the spell was ready. Her eyes looked up at the boring hole into the tyrant before her. Channel your magic, channel into the spell, and call it forth its name. Merlin's words echoed in her mind. She then pulled out the sword back, the magic solidifying her for just a moment, forming a steel blade with gold carvings, and with the echoing cry, she screamed forth at the top of her lungs, Excalibur! The blade of the light swung forth, light bursting from the forth at the blades as it was crashing down. The tyrant let out a horrifying screech as its body was assaulted. Surrounded the light from Twilight's sword, the world began to shake and rumble, being torn apart by the very powerful of the spell itself. Swirling the winds tormented Twilight's ears as the spell began to rock the foundations of existence. The tyrant's cry of pain was barely pierced through the howling winds. Twilight could feel her lungs slipping away from the stable ground, but she could see nothing but the blindly pure of light. The world was then consumed into the spell's vibrant light, overpowering the darkness, the creatures, and even Twilight herself. Her magic had been consumed. She had put everything into that single spell. She closed her eyes and felt the air rushing up around her. Her legs no longer held solid ground. The sensation was falling. The last thing she remembered was her consciousness faded. Twilight let out a groan as the sound of the pulsating beat in her ears. A hoof came to her as she rubbed it, feeling the throb of pain. She had just consumed all of her magic in one go, and the whiplash on her system was biting back at her with vengeance. She was surprised that she was even conscious. She could still feel the magic that was completely empty at the moment. Feeling something warm brushed against her, causing her eyes to shoot open. Almost immediately regretted it. The walls of the room she was in were moving. If she had to guess, they looked like muscles, thick of red and pulsating in and out, constant thumping beat sounding in the combination in their movements. The floor beneath her was made out of the same material. The whole room reminded her of the beating heart. She then stared at shock, unsure of what it was, or why hadn't it ended already. Help! A voice was weakly called out. Twilight lifted her head from the ground, looking around her. A black orb pulsed right through the middle of the center of whatever room she was in, pulsating in time as the rooms on the walls around her. Staring at it, filled her with a sense of pure dread. It was an orb of unnatural origin. It didn't belong here. It shouldn't exist, and yet here it was, defying every senses of reality. Why? It's so cold. Voices came in, but this time from around her. Twilight then looked for her sources, but she couldn't see them. They were different from the first time, but she didn't know what they meant yet. Betrayed. I loved you. For the night. We wanted to be free. She deserved to die. Twilight then shook her head. The voices were practically clawing into her brain. She didn't know what it meant or what she was hearing them. She couldn't understand any of it. Merlin had said the spell would have ended this, but why didn't it stop the nightmare? Why was she still here? I'm sorry. You should have died. You were right. You took our homes. We believed in you. Annie. That's all what's left. Shut up! Twilight cried out, holding her head in her hooves. She couldn't take it. The pain was pounding into her head, and she wanted them to go away. She wanted to end it already. Why was it still happening? You should see. The voice was different. Twilight's eyes popped open as she stared at the source, coming from the black orb. The voice was deep and unnatural. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before. She stared at the orb, unable to comprehend what was going on. She swore her mind deceived her. the faces of the ponies swirling inside of the orb, if that thing was made out of them, and that she was made of from somewhere else. In the middle of the large barren field, she could see Celestia standing on top of the cliff alone, as if she was waiting for someone. And then they came. From the other side of the field, an army appeared, marching straight towards Celestia. She stood her ground unflinching as the army came to us several yards from her position. They easily numbered her thousands, each soldier clad in the same armor Twilight had been seen over Ponyville. A single pony stepped forth, a scar on each face and a flag attached to each side. It bore with the emblem of the moon in the top of the shadow, a symbol Twilight instantly recognized as Luna's cutie mark. Tyrant of Equestria, the commanding pony bellowed, you have trapped our glorious leader, Nightmare Moon, into the eternal prison of the moon. We are her army that remains opposed to you and your eternal rule. You stand alone, face again a legion of 1,000 ponies. The commanding pony stomped his hoof down. Surrender now, and we may yet be merciful. Not even a pony would consider a good god could stand up for this kind of army. Celestia stood still, her gaze unchanging, her glare never once faded, her anger never once wavering. Tyrant of Equestria, speak now. Do you surrender, or shall we end your life here? The commanding pony demanded, slamming his hoof against the ground once more. Though we'll return to thee homes, though we'll plague the five legions of it over once more to our crown, Celestia bellowed in her return, her eyes narrowing, or else thee though will die of all thee. We cower were not to your threats, the commanding pony bellowed back. You have chosen your fate, stallions at arms. And at that moment, the ponies behind the commanding pony raised their weapons. They carried a large variety of raging swords to axes and spears. They all aimed them directly at the lone princess that stood before them. Ready? The commanding pony raised his hoof, the entire army taking a step forward. Charge! The large crowd of ponies let out a roaring cheer as they charged forward, ready to destroy the tyrant that stood in their way. But when they were barely a yard from impaling her, Celestia's wings spread out wide, her eyes glowed brightly in an instant. A large orb of magic surrounded her and exploded outward. Ponies cried out in horrific pain, their flesh melting away as they were blown off by their hooves by the explosion of magic. Fire ablaze intensely around Celestia, the ground charring just from their presence. The charging army didn't falter, rushing straight towards Celestia with their weapons drawn. The princess lowered herself for a moment and then surged forward and broke through their ranks. The battle was exactly the commanding pony predicted, one-sided fight, but not in the army's favor. Celestia took no prisoners. Fur, flesh, skin, and bones all melted around her. Weapons came to her life, floating into the air before turning on their former welders. Magic attacks struck anyone at cane barriers and ratcheted back to their doom of massed soldiers. It wasn't a fight, it was slaughter. It took effortless minutes and for her body to completely destroy the army once stood before her. Nothing but a pile of smoke armor bodies remained, the triumphant monarch perched up on top of it. Twilight could smell the burnt, cooked flesh. The blood was spilled everywhere on the land. Crimson stains now covered Celestia's body, proof of all the ponies that she had killed. Her name never stopped flowing, and all altered her in fury. No pony was left alive to be dragged through the corpses of his fallen allies. Her magic lifted him up, hanging him by his neck and the back hoof of illumination. The commanding pony refused to groan in pain. Most of his flesh was cooked in lacerations, covering what yet about the charred deathly black. The army was for naught, though you hadn't a chance, but those who choose death. Celestia glared at the commanding pony, her words biting deep. When Doe defies the crown, Doe gets death. Does Doe understand now? Instead of lamenting or cowering, the commanding pony began to laugh. The unamused monarch gritted her teeth. But don't you see? The commanding pony coughed. You didn't win. We did. Celestia glared at the armor-clad pony, not understanding what he meant. A grin then formed on his face, revealing for his victory. So if we lost the fight, you have now lost more. People will no longer trust you. His voice grew louder. All the ponies of the army were ponies of your land. They have family. They have loved ones. They had friends. All of them. And you slaughtered them all. You have proven you were a tyrant. He was then overtaken by another preposterous laughter. A tyrant that will never last in Equestria. An enemy that will rise in that could just kill you. And just like Sombra before you, just like Discord before him, he then paused in a bitter-sweet chuckle. You will die, and your training will end. His mocking laughter cut Celestia deep. She had him hanging from a hoofs in death's fury, unforgiving door. Yet he laughed, instead of to confess his guilt and accept his fate. It was mockery of everything that she had lost. Her temper flared, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. With a loud scream, the commanding pony was set to ablaze, his flesh crackling and sizzling, and burning into ash before the wind carried it away. She felt his blackened skeletal remains and laid on top to rest on the mounts of cooked ponies that had once been his army, panting as the body shook. The burning battlefield was then replaced with more than red pulsing through the flesh of the room to which she had been standing. Her legs wobbled, and she tried to recover from it all, staring back at the pulsating orb in the center. The ponies that pressed up against her skin, circling around it again and again. I see, Twilight gulped, closing her eyes as she steadied herself. So that's how it is. She opened up to them again and looked intently into the orb. It wasn't something she could not hit them by conventional means. She would need to grant a spell to take care of. I see. That was your game, Merlin. Twilight chuckled softly to herself as she began to concentrate again. Merlin's spell started to form again, concentrating into a single point before her. The spell required all of her magic to cast. She had already used it once, and there was none left. She would have to rest, mostly for days, to restore her magic to full once more. It would be impossible enough to cast a magic spell once more, not unless the price was paid. The spell would channel something to use as a catalyst. A pony's life of energy, converted into raw magic, would be able to give the shape into the sword a second time. I'll end this once and for all. I'm the only one who could do it now, Twilight told herself, finally understanding the words of the ponies who had come before her. The gleaming of the golden blade once again began to take a shape before her, steadily sapping away from the energy from her every being. No one else has to suffer anymore. No one has to be in pain. This will end it. Twilight opened her eyes, and the sword nearly finished. As she stared at the orb, it pulsed through more wildly as she knew well enough the fear impending on the competition as her spell. Now I could put this all to rest. I might die in the process, but if that means every pony else can live, it's more than a fair trade. The sword shined brightly in the walled room, the orb pulsing rapidly. The cries of ponies long since past echoed around her, but she paid them no mind. This was now what it meant to be. This was how it all ended, with the utterance of a single word, Excalibur. The sword swung down with a mighty force and was once again consumed with the raging light. The screams of tortured souls tore right through the air and were silenced, blown away with the rest of the remaining remains of the dark, twisted world around her. Twilight closed her eyes one final time, the last feeling the sense of harmony filling her heart. This time she knew she could finally rest peacefully.